based on a true story. Emily hurried through the streets of New Hope, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just discovered. The town, which had always seemed so peaceful and uneventful, now felt heavy with a hidden burden. The burden of a secret she never imagined existed. The secret that lay inside that wooden box. The box had been hidden, almost buried among old clothes and papers stored deep in her mother's closet. When she found it, she thought it would just be another lost memory from the past. But when she opened it and saw the contents, the letters, the documents, the name she had never heard before, she felt a tremor inside. Richard Thompson, she repeated the name in her mind, as if it contained a truth she had ignored her entire life. She didn't wait another second. She needed answers. Only one person could help her understand what those letters meant: her grandmother, Grandma Esther. By the time she reached her grandmother's house, her heart was pounding. "Grandma?" Emily called out as she walked through the front door. Her voice was louder than she intended, a reflection of her urgency. Esther was sitting in her old armchair, holding a book. She looked up and smiled, but her smile faded when she saw the anxious expression on Emily's face. "What's wrong, dear?" her grandmother asked, putting the book aside. Emily's hands trembled as she held the letters, unsure of how to begin. "I found something in Mom's things," she said, stepping closer and handing the box to her grandmother. Esther frowned and opened the box carefully, as though she were handling something fragile. When she saw the contents, her fingers hesitated. She picked up one of the letters, adjusted her glasses, and read silently. Her face changed instantly, and Emily could see the pain and hesitation on her grandmother's expression. "Grandma, who is Richard Thompson?" Emily asked, breaking the tense silence. Esther didn't answer right away. She placed the letter on her lap and closed her eyes, as if searching for the strength to reveal something that had been hidden for a long time. When she opened her eyes again, Emily sensed that something deep was about to be revealed, something that would change everything. "Where did you find this?" Esther asked, her voice unsteady. Emily sat on the floor next to her grandmother, trying to keep herself from losing control of her anxiety. "It was in the back of Mom's closet. I didn't even know it was there," Emily replied, staring intently at her grandmother. "Who is he, Grandma? Who is Richard Thompson?" Esther sighed deeply, taking a few seconds before speaking. When she did, her voice was filled with emotion. "Emily, I've always known this day would come," Esther began, her hands clasped tightly around the letters. "Richard Thompson, he's your biological father." It felt like the ground had vanished beneath Emily's feet. Her hands trembled even more, and a mixture of shock, pain, and disbelief flooded her body. She blinked, trying to make sense of the words, but they felt impossible, like a revelation that couldn't be true. "What?" she murmured, almost breathless. "My biological father? But how is that possible? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Esther kept her gaze steady on her granddaughter, but her eyes were filled with deep sadness. "Your mother, she thought it was better this way. Richard left her when he found out she was pregnant. He didn't want to take responsibility, Emily," Esther revealed, her voice breaking slightly. "She believed it would be less painful for you to grow up not knowing about him. She thought she was protecting you, but I told her that one day you had the right to know." Emily stood up abruptly and started pacing around the small living room. Her thoughts were swirling. The name, the man, the father she never knew she had, now hovered in her mind like a shadow. How could her mother hide this? Why had she decided that Emily didn't deserve to know who brought her into the world? Did he know about me? Did he know I existed and just walked away? Emily asked, her voice now filled with pain and bitterness. Esther lowered her gaze, unable to bear the weight of her granddaughter's suffering. "Yes, he knew. Your mother went to him, told him about you, but Richard was different back then. Ambitious, only concerned with his career, his status. He chose to walk away, and your mother made the difficult decision to raise you on her own." Esther shook her head, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. She never wanted you to feel his abandonment. Emily stopped pacing and stood in silence, trying to absorb all the information. Part of her understood her mother's desire to protect her, but another part, an even bigger part, felt betrayed. How could she have grown up not knowing the truth about her own life? Now, with her mother gone, The answers she so desperately needed were buried in a past that only one man could uncover. She sat down again, her eyes fixed on the open box in her grandmother's lap. The letters were there, and the name Richard Thompson hung in the air like a suffocating presence. I need to see him, Grandma. I need to understand. I need answers, Emily said, her voice firm but still heavy with pain. Esther looked at her granddaughter with sorrow, but also with a deep understanding of what she was feeling. There was nothing left to hide. The secret was out, and now only the truth remained, raw and unfiltered. I know, dear, Esther said softly, but Richard, he's not easy to reach. He has a complicated life. A lot of power, a lot of interests. It won't be a simple conversation. It doesn't matter. Emily stood again, this time with more determination. I need to talk to him. I need him to look me in the eyes and tell me why he did this, why he chose to leave me. Esther nodded slowly. She knew trying to dissuade her would be useless. Emily was like her mother, stubborn and determined. Nothing would stop her from going all the way to find her answers. If that's what you feel you must do, then I'll support you, Esther said, gently taking Emily's hand. But be prepared, he's not the man you might expect to find. Emily squeezed her grandmother's hand, her gaze unwavering. I don't expect anything from him, Grandma. I just want the truth, even if it hurts. And with that resolution in her heart, Emily knew the next step was inevitable. Finding Richard Thompson, finding her father. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the imposing building of Thompson Enterprises. Her heart raced as she stared at the massive glass doors that reflected a version of herself that felt small and insignificant. Yet, despite the apprehension tightening in her chest, she was resolute. She was here for answers. Answers only Richard Thompson could give her. This man, her biological father, had abandoned her and her mother, leaving a trail of secrets Emily was determined to unravel. Without hesitating, she walked through the entrance and into the expansive lobby. The sheer scale of the place took her by surprise. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished to perfection, reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers that hung high above. The walls were lined with expensive art, each piece screaming wealth and power. Emily had never felt more out of place, but this wasn't the time for insecurity. She spotted the reception desk, where a woman with immaculate makeup and an expression of utter disinterest sat typing on her computer. Emily approached with a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone clipped and cold, without bothering to look up from her screen. Emily straightened her posture, fighting back the unease growing in her stomach. "I'd like to speak with Richard Thompson. It's a personal matter," Emily said, her voice firmer than she expected. That got the woman's attention. The receptionist paused, then slowly lifted her eyes, assessing Emily with a cold, scrutinizing gaze. Her eyes traveled from Emily's shoes to her face, and a small, dismissive smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, her voice tinged with skepticism. Emily's heart sank a little, but she didn't falter. "No, but it's important. I'm his daughter," Emily said, each word weighing heavily in the air between them. For a brief moment, the receptionist's expression changed, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she quickly masked it. She glanced down at her computer, tapping a few keys, but her voice remained impassive. "Mr. Thompson doesn't take walk-ins, especially without an appointment. You'll need to schedule through his assistant if you want to see him," she said, her forced politeness barely hiding her irritation. Emily felt the sting of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. She had anticipated that seeing Richard wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected to be dismissed so quickly, so coldly. "But I'm his," the receptionist cut her off, eyes now focused back on her screen. "If it's important, I suggest you call the office. There's nothing more I can do for you today." Emily stood there for a moment, stunned by the woman's blatant dismissal. Her fists clenched at her sides, frustration bubbling up. But there was no point in arguing. She could feel eyes from across the lobby glancing her way, and the humiliation began to sink in. With no other option, she turned on her heels and walked out of the building, feeling smaller than when she had entered. Outside, Michael was waiting for her, leaning casually against the hood of his car, his eyes scanning the entrance. As soon as he saw Emily's face, he pushed off the car and walked toward her. "How did it go?" he asked, though the look on her face told him everything. Emily shook her head, trying to suppress the sting of rejection that burned in her chest. "They wouldn't let me in. The receptionist treated me like I was nobody, like I had no right to be there," she said, her voice cracking slightly. She didn't want to cry, but the frustration was overwhelming. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Hey, don't let them get to you. We knew this wasn't going to be easy, but we'll find another way. You'll get your answers," he said softly, his tone filled with the kind of calm she desperately needed. Emily wiped the corner of her eye and took a deep breath, grateful for his presence. I thought maybe if I told them I was his daughter, they'd take me seriously," she said, her voice still shaking with emotion. Michael shook his head, a soft smile on his lips. "People like Richard Thompson don't care about that. He's spent years hiding you, pretending you don't exist. He's not going to make this easy," Michael said, a hint of anger creeping into his voice. "But that doesn't mean we give up." Emily nodded, even though a part of her wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. She wasn't used to this kind of rejection, this feeling of being powerless. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Richard would at least be curious about her. But it was clear now she was nothing to him. Michael leaned against the car again, crossing his arms as he looked down the busy street, thinking. "You know who might be able to help? Lisa," he said suddenly, as if the idea had just occurred to him. Emily looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Lisa? What could she do? She's a journalist. She has connections, access to places we don't. If anyone can find a way to get close to Richard or dig up information, it's her," Michael explained. Emily considered it for a moment. Lisa had always been resourceful, the kind of person who knew how to find things out, but involving her would mean making this whole situation more public. Emily wasn't sure if she was ready for that. "Do you really think she'd be able to help?" Emily asked, hesitant. Michael nodded, confidence in his eyes. "I'm sure of it. And if Richard won't give you the answers willingly, maybe we need to make him uncomfortable enough that he'll have no choice but to face you." There was something about the way Michael said it that made Emily feel a surge of determination again. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. "Okay, let's talk to her," Emily said, a new resolve in her voice. Michael grinned. "That's the Emily I know. Come on, let's go." They got into the car, and as they drove away from the towering building of Thompson Enterprises, Emily felt the weight of the day begin to lift, even if just slightly. She didn't have the answers she sought yet, but with Michael by her side and the possibility of Lisa's help, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Lisa, the one person who might have the means to break through the walls Richard Thompson had built around his secrets. The next day, Emily and Michael met Lisa at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The atmosphere inside was calm, but the tension at their table was palpable. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee, unsure of how to begin. Michael gave her a reassuring look, silently encouraging her to speak. Lisa, who had known both of them for years, sat across from them with her phone on the table, ready to take notes. Finally, Emily gathered her courage and looked Lisa in the eye. "I found out something big, something I never expected," Emily began, her voice low but steady. Lisa leaned forward, sensing the gravity in Emily's tone. She was used to uncovering secrets and had always been quick to recognize when someone was about to drop a bombshell. "What is it?" Lisa asked, her curiosity piqued. Emily glanced at Michael for a brief moment before turning back to Lisa. She took a deep breath, then said, "Richard Thompson. He's my father." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of revelation. Lisa blinked in disbelief, momentarily speechless. She stared at Emily as if trying to process what she had just heard. "Wait, Richard Thompson, as in the Richard Thompson?" Lisa finally managed to ask, her voice almost a whisper. Emily nodded, her expression a mix of frustration and determination. "Yeah, I found out after my mom died. I had no idea, but now I've been trying to reach him, to get him to acknowledge me. But he's shutting me out," she explained, her words laced with pain. "I went to his office, but they wouldn't even let me past the receptionist. He's pretending I don't exist." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her eyes wide as she took in the enormity of the situation. For a journalist like her, this was explosive. Richard Thompson was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the region. His name alone was enough to get people's attention, but the fact that he had a secret daughter, this was something no one would have expected. Holy, this is a bombshell, Emily, Lisa said, shaking her head in disbelief. Richard Thompson hiding a daughter all these years, and you had no clue? Not until I found some old letters after my mom passed. It's been hidden my whole life, Emily admitted, her voice barely hiding the resentment she felt. I don't know why he abandoned us, but I need answers. I need to know why he never cared. Lisa stared at Emily for a moment, then glanced at Michael, who was sitting silently beside her. The look on his face was one of quiet support, but Lisa knew he was just as invested in this as Emily. She could see the determination in his eyes as well. So, what do you need from me? Lisa asked, though she already had a pretty good idea of where this conversation was headed. Emily leaned forward, her voice becoming urgent. I need your help to get to him. I've tried everything I can think of, and I'm out of options. He's too powerful. He controls everything around him, and I can't break through alone. Lisa considered her words for a moment, her mind already racing with possibilities. She loved a good story, and this was the kind of scandal that could shake the foundations of Thompson's empire. But more than that, Emily was her friend, and she could see the desperation in her eyes. Okay, Lisa said finally, a mischievous smile forming on her lips. I think I know a way we can make this happen. Emily and Michael exchanged a quick glance. They knew Lisa well enough to recognize that look. It meant she had an idea, and knowing Lisa, it would be bold. What are you thinking? Michael asked, leaning in. Lisa reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad, flipping through the pages as she explained. Richard is going to be at a charity gala tomorrow night. It's a big event. Lots of important people, media, the works. I have press credentials and can get us in. It's the perfect chance for you to confront him. He won't be able to avoid you in public like he did at his office. Emily's heart raced at the thought. A public event? The idea of confronting Richard in front of all those people made her stomach turn. But Lisa was right. He wouldn't be able to brush her off or hide behind his assistants there. A gala? Emily asked, her voice wavering slightly. You really think I can just walk up to him in front of all those people? Lisa's eyes sparkled with excitement. He won't have a choice. He'll be surrounded by media and big names. If you approach him there, he'll be forced to acknowledge you, or he risks creating a scene. Plus, I'll be there. We can use my press access to get close enough. This is our best shot, Emily. Emily hesitated. The idea of facing Richard in such a public way terrified her, but the need for answers was stronger than her fear. I don't know if I can do this, in front of everyone, Emily whispered, her hands shaking slightly at the thought. Michael, who had been quiet, finally spoke up, his voice steady and calm. You can do this. You've come this far, Emily. You deserve the truth, and he needs to face what he's done. We'll be with you the whole time. Emily looked at him, her resolve slowly returning. He was right. She couldn't back down now, not after everything she had been through. She deserved to know why Richard had chosen to abandon her and her mother, why he had built his empire while pretending she didn't exist. Lisa watched the determination solidify in Emily's eyes and smiled. I'll get us the passes, Lisa said, scribbling down a note in her pad. This is going to be big. You're about to turn his world upside down, Emily. Emily exhaled deeply, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. The thought of seeing Richard face to face sent a jolt of fear through her, but she pushed it down. She couldn't let fear win. Not now. Let's do it, Emily said, her voice firm. Lisa grinned. Tomorrow night, then. We'll meet at my place before the event, and I'll get you ready. You'll need to look the part. This is a high-profile event, and we want to make sure you blend in. Richard's people won't see you coming until it's too late. Emily nodded, though the idea of blending into that world of wealth and power made her feel like an outsider. But she knew it was necessary. She had to be ready for whatever was coming. Michael gave her an encouraging smile. You're going to do great. Just remember why you're doing this. Emily forced a small smile, grateful for his support. But beneath her calm exterior, She could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Tomorrow, everything would change. She would finally confront the man who had shaped her life without ever being a part of it. Tomorrow, Richard Thompson would no longer be able to ignore her. That night, as Emily lay in bed, sleep evaded her. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she would say to Richard, of how he might react. She rehearsed different scenarios, each one more daunting than the last. But no matter how much she tried to prepare herself, the reality of what was coming felt overwhelming. She glanced at her phone, considering texting Michael, but decided against it. He had done enough already. Tomorrow was the real test. Tomorrow, she would face the man who had been nothing more than a ghost in her life until now. And she wasn't backing down. The next morning came too quickly, and as the day wore on, Emily felt a mix of nervous energy and anticipation building inside her. By the time she arrived at Lisa's apartment, the gravity of the night ahead had settled in fully. Lisa greeted her at the door, a garment bag slung over her arm. "Ready to make some waves?" The charity event was already in full swing when Emily entered the grand ballroom. The opulence of the event was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the steady hum of elegant conversation. Emily felt out of place despite the stunning gown Lisa had managed to secure for her. She straightened her posture, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort as her eyes scanned the room. Michael stood close to her, offering his silent support, but even his comforting presence couldn't dispel the nerves twisting inside her. This was it. Tonight, she would come face to face with Richard Thompson. At the far end of the room, Emily spotted him. Richard stood tall, effortlessly commanding the attention of everyone around him. He was surrounded by a small group of businessmen and politicians, all of them hanging on to his every word, laughing at his jokes. To the outside world, he was untouchable, a pillar of success and influence. But to Emily, he was the man who had abandoned her before she even had a chance to know him. Michael leaned in slightly, sensing her hesitation. "You've got this. Don't let him intimidate you," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. "I know. I'm ready," she replied, though a part of her still felt the weight of what was about to happen. Without another word, she began walking toward Richard. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she forced herself to move forward. She had waited too long for this moment. As she got closer, she noticed Richard's demeanor, confident, composed, entirely in control of the room. It only fueled her resolve. He had spent years pretending she didn't exist, and tonight she wouldn't let him get away with it. Finally, she reached him. Emily gently touched his arm, her fingers barely brushing his expensive suit jacket. Richard turned, his eyes locking onto hers, and for a brief moment confusion flickered across his face. But when recognition set in, his entire expression hardened, his smile vanishing. "What are you doing here?" Richard hissed, his voice low and cold. He looked around quickly, clearly uncomfortable with her sudden appearance. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard's eyes narrowed, and without another word, he motioned for her to follow him. He led her through the crowded ballroom, expertly navigating the sea of people without drawing attention. They walked in silence until they reached a private room off to the side of the main hall. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. As soon as the door closed behind them, Richard turned to face her, his expression sharp and impatient. "What do you want, Emily?" he asked. His voice clipped, as if she were wasting his time. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "I want to know why," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you leave? Why did you abandon me and my mom?" Richard's face remained impassive, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He let out a sigh, shaking his head as if this entire conversation was an inconvenience to him. "Emily, that was a long time ago," he said dismissively. "I've moved on. I have a life, one that doesn't include you." The coldness of his words hit her like a slap. Emily felt the sting of tears in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wasn't here to cry. She was here to get answers. "You can't just ignore this," she said, her voice rising. "I grew up without a father because of you. You never cared, not once. Don't you think I deserve an explanation?" Richard crossed his arms, his gaze hardening. "You deserve nothing from me," he said bluntly. Your mother made her choices, and I made mine. I don't owe you or anyone else anything. The past is dead, Emily. Let it go." Emily felt the weight of his words crush down on her, but she refused to crumble under it. She took a step closer, her voice trembling with emotion but unwavering in its determination. "I'm your daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't just pretend I don't exist. I've spent my whole life wondering who you were, wondering why you didn't want me. Do you even care? Do you even feel anything about what you did?" Richard's expression darkened, but he didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the door, as if calculating how quickly he could escape this conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost dangerous. "What do you want from me, Emily? An apology? Redemption?" he sneered. "I'm not the man you're hoping I am. I've built a life, an empire, and nothing, not even you, is going to tear that down. So if you think you can come here and demand some kind of reckoning, you're wrong." Emily's heart sank. She had expected him to be cold, to try to push her away, but this was worse than she had imagined. He didn't just want to distance himself, he wanted her erased from his life entirely. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not here to destroy your life, I just wanted to know you. But now I see that's never going to happen," she said, her voice filled with a sadness that felt like it was breaking her in half. "You've made your choice." Richard's eyes flickered just for a second with something. Was it regret? Guilt? It disappeared just as quickly as it came. "That's right," he said firmly. "Now if you're done, I'd like you to leave. I have an event to get back to." Emily stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man she had once hoped to find. But there was nothing, just a wall she would never break through. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, the weight of the confrontation hit her like a wave. She could barely breathe, the tears she had been holding back now threatening to spill. Michael was waiting for her near the entrance, his expression filled with concern the moment he saw her face. He stepped forward, his arms instinctively reaching out to her. "What happened?" he asked softly, though he could already tell by the look in her eyes. Emily shook her head, her voice barely a whisper as the emotions she had been holding in finally broke free. "He doesn't care, Michael. He doesn't care about me at all." Michael's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close as she let the tears fall. He didn't say anything. There were no words that could make this better. All he could do was be there for her, to hold her together as she fell apart. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with sympathy. They stood there for a long moment, her sobs quiet against his chest, as the reality of Richard's cold rejection settled into her heart. The next morning, Emily's tears had dried, but the wound was still fresh. And as much as she wanted to retreat, to lick her wounds in private, something inside her shifted. She wasn't done. She wasn't going to let Richard destroy her. The morning after the gala, everything changed. Emily woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop. Groggy and emotionally drained, she grabbed the phone from her bedside table, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the light. A barrage of notifications lit up her screen, messages, missed calls, and a news alert from the local paper. Her heart sank as she opened the article. Richard Thompson rejects daughter at charity event. It was Lisa's story, and it was everywhere. The article detailed Emily's confrontation with Richard, his cold dismissal, and how he had refused to acknowledge her as his daughter. Emily stared at the screen, feeling exposed and vulnerable. She had agreed to the article because she wanted the truth to come out. But now that it was out there, she wasn't prepared for the onslaught that followed. The headline spread like wildfire. By midday, the story was the talk of New Hope, and Richard's perfect public image began to show cracks. The whispers of disbelief turned into public scrutiny. How could a man of such standing reject his own daughter? The media circled like vultures, eager for more details. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Thompson stood in his office, eyes glued to his phone as he read the article for the 5th time. His jaw tightened, fury radiating off him. He had spent years building his reputation, his empire, and now this girl, his mistake, had the audacity to expose him. His finger jabbed at his phone screen, and within seconds his lawyer's voice came through on the other end. "We need to shut this down, now." Richard growled, his voice cold and measured despite the rage bubbling just below the surface. "I'm already on it," replied his lawyer, his voice calm as if this was just another day of damage control. But Richard wasn't satisfied. "I don't think you understand," he interrupted. "This isn't just some minor scandal. She's dragging my name through the mud. I want her silenced. I don't care how you do it." "Understood, Richard. We'll start a disinformation campaign. Rumors, character assassination, the usual. We can spread some damaging stories about her, make her seem unreliable. We'll paint her as an opportunist looking to tarnish your reputation for money." Richard's eyes glinted dangerously as he stared out of the window of his office, watching the city below. "Good. I want it handled discreetly, but effectively. By the time we're done, no one will believe a word she says." The following days were hell for Emily. At first, it was just a few whispers around town, the usual gossip from people who reveled in scandal. But then the rumors started. People she had never spoken to began claiming she was a liar, a troublemaker who had been after Richard's money all along. Anonymous threats arrived in her inbox, her phone buzzing constantly with messages from unknown numbers, each one more vile than the last. "You're ruining a good man's life. You'll regret this, you little liar. Go back to wherever you came from." The attacks were relentless. Emily felt as though the walls were closing in on her, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, she felt truly alone. The weight of Richard's influence was suffocating her, pressing down until she could barely breathe. One evening, after receiving yet another threatening message, Emily couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She grabbed her jacket and hurried out the door, desperate for the one person who had always given her strength. When she arrived at Grandma Esther's house, her emotions poured out before she could even say a word. "Grandma, he's destroying me," Emily sobbed, collapsing into her grandmother's arms. "He's turning everyone against me. I don't know what to do." Grandma Esther, always calm, always strong, gently stroked Emily's hair as she cried, her old hands firm but comforting. "Hush now, dear," Esther said softly, leading Emily to the worn sofa. "The truth always comes out, no matter how hard someone tries to hide it. He's trying to break you because he's scared of what you might do next." Emily wiped her eyes, her heart aching with frustration. "But he has all the power. He's rich, connected. I'm just me. How can I fight him?" Esther leaned forward, her eyes sharp, filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen more than her share of battles. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. He's using lies to cover up his guilt. That means you've already hurt him more than he expected. You just need to keep pushing." Emily looked at her grandmother, absorbing her words. Despite the pain and the fear, something sparked inside her. She wasn't going to let Richard win. Not like this. "But how?" she asked, her voice still wavering. "You've got good people by your side. Lisa, Michael, they believe in you. Use that, and don't be afraid to dig deeper. Richard's not invincible. There's more to his empire than meets the eye." Emily sat in silence, thinking about what Grandma Esther had said. The attacks on her character were brutal, but they were a sign of Richard's desperation. He was trying to silence her because he feared the truth. Maybe there was something more, something bigger. The next day, Emily called Lisa and Michael. Her resolve hardened. They met in the same cafe where this all began. But this time, Emily wasn't the broken girl she had been before. She was determined, her eyes filled with purpose. "We need to find something on him," Emily said the moment they sat down. "He's trying to destroy me, and I'm not going to sit back and let him do it." Lisa leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "Richard's hiding something. He's too powerful, too calculated. We need to dig into his past, his business, everything. If we can find something, anything that exposes him, we can turn this around." Michael nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. A man like Richard doesn't get to where he is without some skeletons in the closet. We just have to find them." Lisa smiled, her journalist instincts already kicking into high gear. "I knew there was more to this story. I can start looking into his business dealings, maybe find some old contacts who knew him when he was building his empire. If there's dirt on him, I'll find it." Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this fight. With Lisa and Michael by her side, she had hope. They spent hours brainstorming, going over everything they knew about Richard and planning how to dig deeper into his life. As the hours passed, a plan began to form. That night, Emily returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear was still there, the uncertainty lingering at the edges of her mind, but she was ready to fight back, ready to bring Richard's carefully constructed world crashing down. In the days that followed, Lisa dug through public records, interviewed old contacts, and unearthed documents that pointed to suspicious business dealings. Slowly but surely, they began to piece together the truth about Richard Thompson. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was corrupt, deeply involved in illegal financial schemes that could ruin him if they came to light. They had found the leverage they needed. It was time to take it to the authorities. Emily stood at the brink of exposing the man who had tried to erase her. The stakes were higher than ever, and this time, it wasn't just about reclaiming her identity, it was about justice. The investigation was long, grueling, and often frustrating, but Lisa was relentless. Her contacts in the world of journalism and law enforcement opened doors that would have otherwise remained tightly shut. Every day, Emily waited anxiously for updates, torn between hope and fear. She knew they were closing in on something, but the weight of it all was becoming harder to carry. Michael was her constant source of support, always there with words of encouragement, always believing in her when her faith in the process wavered. Lisa spent hours sifting through documents, connecting with people who had crossed paths with Richard during his rise to power. Slowly but surely, a dark picture of Richard's business dealings began to form. And then, they hit the breakthrough they had been waiting for. "You're not going to believe what I just found," Lisa said one evening, bursting into Emily's small apartment with a folder tucked under her arm. Emily and Michael looked up from the table where they'd been discussing their next steps. Lisa's eyes gleamed with a mix of excitement and triumph. She threw the folder onto the table, scattering papers in front of them. "It's all here," Lisa said, practically buzzing with energy. "Richard's dirty money trail. He's been involved in some serious financial fraud for years. Offshore accounts, illegal deals, embezzlement, the whole works." Emily stared at the documents, her heart pounding. She had imagined this moment, pictured what it would feel like to finally have the proof that Richard was far from the untouchable man he pretended to be. But now that it was in front of her, the reality of it all was almost too much to comprehend. "This is it," Michael said quietly, his eyes scanning the documents. "This is enough to bring him down." Emily's hands shook slightly as she reached for one of the papers, her eyes tracing the numbers and names. All of it tied back to Richard, the shady business deals, the offshore accounts that funneled millions, the silent partners who helped him cover up his tracks. It was all there, in black and white. Lisa leaned forward, her voice low but intense. "If we get this into the hands of the authorities, he's finished. They'll have no choice but to investigate, and once they do, it's only a matter of time before the house of cards he's built comes crashing down." Emily's heart raced. For so long, Richard had been the one with all the power, the one pulling the strings, making her feel small, insignificant. But now, she held the cards. For the first time in her life, she had the power to make him answer for everything he'd done. Not just to her, but to countless others he had hurt along the way. "We need to be smart about this," Michael said, breaking the silence. "We can't just send this to the authorities and hope for the best. Richard's got connections. We need to make sure this is airtight, that he can't wiggle his way out of it." Lisa nodded in agreement. "I've already thought of that. I know someone at the FBI who's clean, someone we can trust. If we hand this to him, there's no way Richard can make this go away." Emily's mind raced as she considered the magnitude of what they were about to do. Bringing Richard down would change everything. His wealth, his power, his carefully curated public image, all of it would be shattered. And yet, there was a heaviness that settled over her as she realized that this was the end of the line. Once this was set in motion, there would be no going back. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice quiet but firm. "This will destroy him." Michael looked at her, his gaze steady and filled with compassion. "He made his choices. Emily, this isn't on you. He's hurt too many people for too long. It's time he faces the consequences. Lisa placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, her voice gentle but resolute. This isn't just about revenge, Emily. It's about justice. For you, for everyone he's manipulated and lied to. You're doing the right thing. Emily took a deep breath, nodding. All right, let's do it. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Lisa made the arrangements, carefully planning every step to ensure that Richard wouldn't see it coming. They met with her contact at the FBI, a sharp, no-nonsense agent named Davis, who took the documents with a solemn nod. This is enough to start an investigation, Agent Davis said, flipping through the papers. If what's in here holds up, Richard Thompson won't be able to escape this. We'll make sure of it. Emily sat across from him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. She wanted justice, but she also knew how powerful Richard was. She couldn't shake the nagging doubt that he would somehow find a way to slip through the cracks. We'll keep you informed, Davis said as they left his office. But once the investigation starts, it's out of your hands. Just be prepared for what's coming. Emily wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but she had a feeling that this was far from over. Days passed, then a week. Emily could feel the tension building. She knew the investigation had started, but there had been no word yet, no indication that Richard even knew what was coming. Then one morning, Emily's phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced down and froze. Breaking news: Richard Thompson arrested in connection with fraud and corruption scandal. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she clicked on the article. The headline was accompanied by a picture of Richard being led out of his office in handcuffs, his face tight with anger and disbelief. The article detailed the charges against him: financial fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. It was everything they had uncovered, laid bare for the world to see. She stared at the screen, her emotions swirling in a chaotic mix. She should have felt victorious, she told herself. This was what they had been working toward for weeks. Richard was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. The man who had caused her so much pain, who had tried to ruin her, was now the one whose life was falling apart. But instead of triumph, Emily felt a strange hollowness settle in her chest. She had spent so long chasing this moment, fighting for the truth to come out. And now that it had, she wasn't sure how to feel. Michael appeared in the doorway, noticing the look on her face. "Emily? What's wrong?" he asked, walking over to her. Emily handed him the phone, watching as his eyes scanned the screen. He let out a low whistle. "It's done. He's been arrested," Michael said, looking back at her. "You did it," Emily nodded, but the words felt heavy in her mouth. "I don't know if this is what I wanted," she whispered. "I wanted him to pay, but now that it's happening, it feels empty." Michael sat down beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I get it. You spent your whole life wondering about him, hoping for something different. But this was never going to be a fairy tale ending, Emily. Richard made his choices. He hurt you, and a lot of other people. He's finally getting what he deserves." Emily leaned into Michael, her eyes still on the news article. She knew he was right. This was justice. It had to be. But as the story of Richard's arrest continued to unfold on the screen, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. A few days later, a letter arrived at her door. The envelope was simple, unmarked, but the handwriting on the front made her stomach turn. It was from Richard. Weeks had passed since Richard's arrest, and Emily was slowly finding her way back to some sense of normalcy. The whirlwind of media attention had died down, and though she still felt the lingering effects of everything that had happened, she was trying to move forward. She threw herself into her work and spent more time with Michael and Lisa, grateful for their unwavering support through it all. But the weight of the past still clung to her, unresolved. Then one day, as she returned home from an errand, Emily found a letter waiting for her. The envelope was simple, with no return address, but she immediately recognized the handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat. It was from Richard. She stared at it for a long time, her hands shaking slightly. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever was inside. After everything he had done, after all the pain and betrayal, part of her didn't want to hear anything he had to say. But another part of her, the part that had always wondered, always yearned for answers, knew she had to open it. Finally, she sat down at the kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of her like a loaded weapon. Slowly, she tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. The words were brief, written in Richard's unmistakable, precise handwriting. Emily, I know I've made terrible choices. I'm paying for them now. Pride and ambition blinded me, and I regret the pain I caused. If you can, I ask for your forgiveness. Richard. Emily's eyes moved over the words again and again. She read the letter at least 5 times, each word sinking deeper into her mind. There was no excuse in his message, no attempt to justify his actions, just regret. And the faintest hint of vulnerability, something she had never associated with Richard Thompson. She sat there for a long time, the letter still in her hand, trying to make sense of what she was feeling. The anger she had carried for so long was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but there was something else too, an exhaustion. She was tired of holding on to all the hurt, tired of letting his actions define her emotions. Her whole life had been shaped by his absence, by his rejection. And now, even in his downfall, he was still there, casting a shadow over everything. Emily didn't know how to process the letter. She folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope, her mind swimming with conflicting thoughts. That evening, she drove to Grandma Esther's house, seeking the kind of clarity only her grandmother seemed able to offer. When she arrived, Esther was in her usual spot, sitting in the cozy living room, knitting quietly. She looked up as Emily walked in and immediately noticed the look on her face. "Something's bothering you," Esther said softly, setting her knitting aside. Emily sat down across from her, pulling the letter out of her bag. She handed it to her grandmother without a word, and Esther took it, reading it slowly, her brow furrowing as she did. After a long moment, she folded the letter and placed it gently on the table between them. "Richard wrote to you," Esther said quietly, her eyes meeting Emily's. "What are you feeling?" Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I thought this would make me feel better, but it doesn't. I'm still angry, but at the same time I feel like I can't carry this anymore. I don't want him to have this power over me." Esther leaned forward, taking Emily's hands in hers, her grip warm and reassuring. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook for what they've done. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of that pain. Richard made his choices, and now he's facing the consequences. But what you do with this, how you move forward, that's your choice, Emily. Emily felt the tears welling up in her eyes as her grandmother spoke. She had spent so much time trying to get answers from Richard, trying to understand why he had abandoned her. Now that she had those answers, or at least some form of closure, she didn't know what to do with the emotions swirling inside her. "I don't know if I can forgive him," Emily admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "He hurt me so much. He hurt my mom. How do I forgive someone for something like that?" Esther's eyes softened as she gave Emily's hands a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to do it for him, dear. Forgiveness isn't about him. It's about you. You forgive so that you can move on, so that you can live your life without that weight hanging over you. It's not easy, but it's a way to find peace." Emily sat back, her thoughts swirling. Forgiveness. The very word felt heavy in her mouth. Could she really let go of all the anger, all the pain she had carried for so long? Would forgiving Richard mean absolving him of everything he had done? "I don't know if I'm ready," Emily said after a long silence. "But I do know that I don't want him controlling my life anymore. I want to be free of him." Esther smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's the first step, dear. The rest will come in time, but you're already on the right path." Emily nodded, feeling the weight on her chest lighten ever so slightly. Maybe she wasn't ready to fully forgive Richard yet, but she knew she needed to start letting go of the anger, if only for her own sake. "Thank you, Grandma," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Esther reached out and wiped away a tear from Emily's cheek, her touch as gentle as ever. "You'll be just fine, my dear. You're stronger than you think." That night, Emily drove home, her mind still processing everything. She knew that forgiving Richard wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that holding on to the bitterness wasn't helping her anymore. As she sat alone in her apartment, she unfolded the letter once more, reading it slowly, This time, the words didn't sting as much. They didn't feel like they had control over her. For the first time in what felt like years, Emily felt a glimmer of peace. She wasn't there yet, but she was on her way. She was no longer defined by Richard's absence, no longer held back by his rejection. She was moving forward, on her terms. In the months that followed, Emily's life began to take on a new sense of purpose. She focused on her own goals, her relationships, and the things that truly mattered. She no longer felt the same pull toward the past. And though the wounds Richard had left behind were still healing, she knew that someday she would be able to forgive. Not for his sake, but for hers. As she sat in her office one afternoon, working on a new project that had been keeping her busy, she received a call. It was unexpected, and the voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in months. It was from the prison. Richard wanted to see her. The months that followed were transformative for Emily. After years of emotional turmoil, betrayals, and uncovering painful truths, she decided to channel her energy into something meaningful. With Michael and Lisa by her side, she founded an organization dedicated to helping vulnerable young people, kids who, like her, had been abandoned or felt lost, left without guidance or support. The idea for the organization had come to her one night, lying awake and thinking about how different her life might have been if someone had reached out to her earlier, given her the tools to navigate the difficult path she had been forced to walk. Now, she wanted to be that source of strength for others, to turn her pain into something that could inspire and uplift. With Lisa's experience in communications and Michael's business acumen, the three of them quickly built a foundation for the organization. Emily threw herself into the work, using her story not as a source of shame, but as a way to connect with those who needed help the most. The pain of her past, though still present, began to feel more like a distant memory, something that shaped her but no longer controlled her. One evening, after months of preparation, Emily stood in front of a crowd of supporters, donors, and the young people her organization was set to help. It was the official launch event, a celebration of everything they had built together. The room buzzed with excitement, but as Emily stood on stage, microphone in hand, the weight of what she had accomplished settled over her. Looking out at the audience, she saw familiar faces: Lisa, Michael, Grandma Esther, and countless others who had come to support the cause. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding with emotion as she began her speech. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Emily started, her voice strong, though her hands trembled slightly. "For so long I lived with a past that felt impossible to escape. The truth about my family, the rejection I faced, it consumed me. But over time I realized that the challenges we face don't define us. What matters is what we do with our pain, how we choose to move forward." The room was silent, everyone hanging on her words. Emily's eyes scanned the audience, feeling a sense of connection with each person there. "Each of us has a story," she continued, her voice growing more confident. "Some are filled with heartbreak, others with struggle. But I've learned that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to transform our pain into something greater. We can take what has hurt us and use it to help others. That's what tonight is about. That's what this organization is about." As she spoke, she could see some of the younger kids in the audience watching her intently. These were the kids who had been through their own battles, who had felt lost or abandoned, just as she once had. And now, through her work, she could offer them hope, the same hope she had once searched for. "I want each of you to know," Emily said, her voice softening, "that no matter what you've been through, your story isn't over. You have the power to write the next chapter, to take control of your life and make it something beautiful. Pain is part of life, but it doesn't have to be the end of it. Together, we can turn that pain into strength, into something that can change lives." When Emily finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, courteous clapping of a formal event. It was genuine, heartfelt. As she stood there, the weight of everything she had endured seemed to lift, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose. She had found her voice, her truth. He was using it to help others find theirs. Michael appeared beside her on stage, holding a bouquet of flowers. His eyes were bright with pride as he handed them to her. "You were incredible," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. Look at what you've built." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. For so long, she had wondered if she would ever be able to move on from her past, if she could ever truly find peace after everything that had happened. But standing there, surrounded by people who believed in her, she realized that the future wasn't just possible, it was bright. "I couldn't have done it without you," Emily replied, looking up at him. "You and Lisa, you've been my rock through all of this." Michael grinned, his eyes sparkling with humor. "Well, it's nice to hear that I'm good for something." They both laughed, the tension of the night fading away as they stood together, soaking in the moment. Lisa soon joined them on stage, her arm wrapped around Emily's shoulders as the three of them looked out at the crowd. "We're just getting started," Lisa said, her voice full of excitement. "This is only the beginning." Emily nodded, feeling a surge of determination. The future was no longer something to fear, it was something to embrace. She had been through hell, but she had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make a difference. As the evening drew to a close, Emily found herself alone for a moment, standing by the edge of the stage and watching as people mingled and celebrated. Grandma Esther approached, her wise eyes twinkling with pride. "You did good, my dear," Esther said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Emily's throat tightened at the mention of her mother, but this time the pain wasn't overwhelming. Instead, it felt like a quiet, gentle ache, a reminder of how far she had come. "I hope so," Emily whispered, her eyes glistening. "I feel like I'm finally living in a way she would have wanted. I'm finally doing something that matters." Esther smiled warmly, placing a hand on Emily's cheek. "You've turned your pain into something beautiful, Emily. That's the greatest legacy you could leave." Emily leaned into her grandmother's touch, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She had carried so much pain for so long, but now, for the first time in her life, she felt free. Free to live, free to love, free to build a future that was hers. As the night went on, Emily joined her friends again, laughing and celebrating the success of the event. The weight of the past no longer hung over her like a shadow. It was there, yes, a part of her story, a part of who she was, but it no longer defined her. She was Emily Johnson, a daughter, a friend, a leader, and a survivor. And this was just the beginning of her new life, a life she would live on her own terms with the people she loved by her side. The future, once clouded by darkness, now stretched before her, full of light and endless possibilities.